All right, second period. So we're going to start this reading on page 4 of your text booklet. And I'm going to read the annotation focus, and we're going to mark that up, and then I'm going to turn this around so we can actually read it together and annotate it. So follow along with me. I'm going to give you a second to find your spot. I have my finger on annotation focus. As you read, annotate for why and how Jews were persecuted and targeted as scapegoats throughout history. So we want to know why and how Jews were targeted and used as scapegoats throughout history. Why other people were blaming them and how other people were blaming them for things they didn't do that actually were the fault of others. So I'm going to turn this around so we can annotate together. All right, first thing I want you to do is circle why. We're looking for the reasons or the beliefs behind why Jews were targeted and persecuted against. Also circle how. We also want to think how, what ways or actions or strategies were used when Jews were targeted and persecuted against. So make sure you have that down. We're thinking about the reasons behind this persecution and what actually happened, the actions that would be considered persecution. All right, so let's get started. Remember, first time I've done this on tape, so we'll see how it goes. Cool, I'm gonna have this highlighter with me. Okay. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, American and French Jews felt vulnerable as their countries debated their loyalty. In the mid-1800s, Germans argued over whether or not Jews could belong in the German nation. All of those debates were influenced by hundreds of years of prejudice, hate, and violence towards Jews. This reading is going to help us trace this prejudice, hate, and violence towards Jews, and that connects to that title as well. In much of Europe during the mid-ages, Christians blamed Jews for the plague. In many towns, officials arrested Jews, confiscated their property, and burned them at the stake. All right, we got that caption here. And I'm actually going to underline something here. Christians blamed Jews for the plague. So I see a very specific example of scapegoating. I'm actually going to label that even though it's not my annotation focus. But it is an example specifically of scapegoating. And I might actually label that, well, here, let's go. Arrested Jews, confiscated their property, and burned them at the stake. This is the how. Sweet, let's keep reading. Judaism, a religious faith that had existed for more than 3,000 years, is the oldest monotheistic religion. If you think back to pre-AP, monotheistic, one God. Throughout much of the faith's history, Jews lived in territories ruled by other groups. They were often targeted as the other and made scapegoats for disasters, tragedies, and misfortunes suffered by societies in which they lived. Continuous rumors, lies, myths, and misinformation about Jews have existed throughout history, and many of them persist in the contemporary world. Often this hatred has led to violence. So the how here, continuous rumors, lies, myths, and misinformation. I'm going to label that too. Historians have traced anti-Jewish myths, hatred, and violence back more than 2,000 years to the time of the Roman Empire. Tensions with the Romans led Jews in Palestine to revolt in 66 CE. The Romans responded violently. Historian Doris Bergen explains, the early Romans were polytheistic. I remember that word from pre-AP. Polytheistic, more than one God. I already see a difference with Jews. And worshiped the emperor as God, also a difference than Judaism. Roman authorities worried that Jewish refusal to worship local and imperial gods would jeopardize the security of the state. At times, such unease, coupled with political conflicts, turned into open persecution and attacks. In 17 CE, the Romans destroyed Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the focal point of Jewish life up to that time. 60 years later, they expelled or forced out the Jews of Palestine, scattering them from the region that had become their home. Okay, I gotta pause. I gotta go back to my annotation focus. First thing I see is the why. Why Jews were persecuted. Go back and reread. Why did Romans specifically target Jews? Well, I'm going to underline here. We see Jews had really different religious beliefs. And Jews refused to worship the Roman gods. That scared Romans. So I'm going to label that the why. And then the how. What did the Romans do to act on this belief? Well, find it. What are some action verbs here? Romans destroyed a Jewish temple. And then they forced out Jews from Palestine. Label that how and how. Let's keep going. During that same period, a new faith was born out of Judaism and began to spread across the Roman Empire. Bergen continues. The rise of Christianity added new fuel to anti-Jewish sentiments. Christianity grew out of Judaism. Jesus himself was a Jew, as were his messengers and supporters. Nevertheless, early Christians tried to separate themselves from other Jews, both to win followers from other non-Jewish world and to gain favor with Roman imperial authorities. Some Christians also stressed their loyalty to the Roman Empire by pointing out that the kingdom of God was not of this earth and therefore did not compete with Rome. Such efforts paid off, and in less than 400 years, all right, guys, this is my cat Boomy. She's gotta move. All right, baby. Here we go. Such efforts paid off, and in less than 400 years, Christianity went from being a persecuted branch of Judaism into being the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. Okay, let's quick pause here because we got a lot of how and whys. So let's go back to the paragraph before. And I see that Christianity specifically tried to separate from Jews in order to gain followers and the favor of the Roman Empire. So I'm going to label this. Think to yourself, what would you label it? How or why? I think it's both. Let's pick up where we stopped. Top of page 5. It is significant that some early Christian accounts blame Jews for Jesus' death, even though crucifixion was specifically Roman form of punishment commonly practiced during Jesus' time. Pause here. This is a big one. Some early Christian accounts blamed Jews for Jesus' death. The myth that had Jewish mobs demanding Jesus' death while the Roman governor Pontius Pilate remained innocent allowed later Christians to emphasize their difference from Judaism and downplay the hostility that Roman authorities had shown towards Christianity in its early stages. So we see here specifically Christians emphasizing their differences from Judaism to gain respect in Rome. All of the false accusations against Jews associated with the Roman Empire period, that Jews were traitors, that they killed Christ, remained present in Europe into the 20th century. So we see these attitudes, this anti-Semitic attitudes, remain for years and years and years to come. In the Middle Ages, from about the 800s to the 1500s were difficult times for Jews in Europe. Often, crusades against Muslims and Christians started off or ended up with violent attacks on Jews. Such attacks, known as pogroms, were also common responses to the outbreak of the plague or other disasters. For example, in many parts of Europe, the Black Death of 1348 sparked brutal pogroms as Christians blamed Jews for somehow causing the epidemic of the bubonic plague. Let's pause here. I see another form of scapegoating. Think to yourself, where do you see scapegoating? We see Jews being blamed for what? For the bubonic plague. Mobilized by such accusations, Christian mobs sometimes spontaneously, sometimes urged on by government and church leaders, attacked Jewish homes and communities, stealing, destroying, and killing. The scale of the pogroms, those violent attacks, varied widely, from brief local incidents to week-long massacres that swept throughout entire region. In their wake, they left Christians a habit of using Jews as scapegoats, and among Jews, a sense of vulnerability and a range of defensive tactics, such as paying protective money, sticking together, and keeping a low profile. Let's pause there, go back. How are Jews being targeted? What's happening to Jewish communities? Go back, underline, or highlight. Attacked Jewish homes, stole from Jews, destroyed, and killed. We got lots of pogroms that could be brief and small, or week-long massacres, killing of many at once throughout the entire region. I'm going to label that. Let's keep reading. Keep looking for examples of persecution. In addition to random waves of violence, Jews face harassment and restrictions of various kinds from governments across Europe. So now this isn't just happening person to person. We see harassment and restrictions from governments. In some cases, regulations force Jews to live in certain areas or ghettos, a part of a city in which members of a minority group live, typically as a result of social, legal, or economic pressure. Okay, so I'm going to label that. Force Jews to live in certain areas or ghettos. Sometimes Jews were required to wear identifying badges. Elsewhere, state authorities drove Jews out of their territories altogether. In 1492, for example, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain expelled all Jews and Muslims from the Spanish Empire, except those who agreed to convert to Christianity. Throughout the Middle Ages, Jews everywhere in Europe faced limitations on the job they could hold, as well as the kinds of property they could own. Take a second, go back. What examples of persecution do you see? Underline them. Wear identifying badges, drove Jews out of their territories, and we have this specific one that happened in Spain. If Jews, and we also have an example of Muslims, if Jews and Muslims didn't convert, they would be forced out of Spain. Limitations on jobs and types of property. Let's get ready for paragraph 9. Some church leaders and government rulers tried to convince or coerce Jews to abandon their religion and convert to Christianity. But even conversion did not necessarily solve the problems of intolerance. converts from Judaism to Christianity in 1500 Spain found that they were still viewed with suspicion and regarded as somehow tainted by supposed Jewish blood. The Protestant Reformation did not improve the lot of European Jews. At first, its leaders, the German monk Martin Luther, hoped that his break with what he considered the corrupt Church of Rome would inspire mass conversions of Jews to Christianity. When the anticipated wave of baptisms did not occur, Luther turned against the Jews, whom he ridiculed as stubborn and hard-necked. In 1542, he wrote a pamphlet called Against the Jews and Their Lies. That writing, with its vicious characterization of Jews as parasites and its calls to set their synagogues and schools on fire, would later be widely quoted in Hitler's Germany. Other medieval images and the association of Jews with the devil charge that Jews used the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes, and that also survived into the modern era. Couple more examples of persecution. Find them. So this guy, Martin Luther, thinks that he can inspire many Jews to convert to Christianity. Doesn't work, and so he starts publishing all this literature against the Jewish people that later is going to actually influence the Nazis. Calling Jews parasites, telling people to set their synagogues and schools on fire, associating them with the devil. All of this survives and may influence modern anti-Semitism. We're going to pause here and we're going to get ready in your question booklet. So let's move to your question booklet to kind of synthesize our learning.